The airport was bustling with the usual chaos of departures and arrivals, the echo of rolling suitcases and overhead announcements blending into a constant hum. Among the sea of travelers was a woman in her late 20s, visibly weary, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair tied in a messy bun. She was clutching the hand of her 3-year-old son, who clung tightly to a small, well-worn teddy bear. The toddler's eyes were heavy with sleep, yet he remained alert, feeding off his mother's anxious energy. She shuffled forward in the boarding line, balancing a large diaper bag on one shoulder, her purse on the other, and a folded baby blanket crammed under her arm. Her boarding pass was wrinkled from being clutched in her hand for too long. As she approached the gate agent, she smiled politely, though her lips trembled slightly, betraying her exhaustion. The child let out a soft whine, and she crouched quickly to reassure him, her voice calm but strained. "Just a little longer, sweetheart. We're almost there." They boarded the plane near the end of the group, slipping quietly down the narrow aisle. Passengers already seated barely acknowledged them, some turning slightly away as the child's teddy bear brushed their knees. She apologized softly under her breath, careful not to cause any disturbance. When they reached their row, middle and window seats near the back, she carefully helped her son into the window seat, buckled him in, and handed him a juice box from her bag. As she slid into her own seat, the stress of the day seemed to weigh even heavier. Her body ached, and her eyes burned from the lack of sleep. She glanced around nervously, aware that flying with a child could draw unwanted attention or judgment. She hoped, more than anything, that her son would fall asleep and that no one nearby would be bothered. Her shoulders sagged slightly as she let out a deep sigh, trying to summon the last bit of strength she had left for the journey ahead. As she adjusted herself in the cramped airplane seat, still catching her breath from the hustle of boarding, the woman finally turned to acknowledge the man seated in the aisle seat beside her. He had arrived just moments before her, placing his leather briefcase under the seat in front of him with practiced ease. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit with subtle pinstripes, a crisp white shirt, and polished black shoes, he looked every bit the image of a successful professional. His silver wristwatch glinted under the cabin lights as he adjusted his seatbelt with a casual, fluid motion. Their eyes met briefly, hers apologetic, his calm. "I'm so sorry if he causes any disturbance," she said quickly, gesturing to her son who was now yawning and holding the teddy bear close. "He usually sleeps through most flights, but it's been a long day." The man offered a gentle, understanding smile that immediately eased some of the tension in her shoulders. "It's all right," he replied in a deep, even tone. "I have a little one at home too. I understand how exhausting this can be." His words weren't just polite, they were sincere, and they surprised her. She gave a faint smile in return, grateful for his kindness. Her son glanced up at the man and offered a shy smile. The man gave a small wave, then leaned back and took out a tablet, likely preparing to catch up on work or read during the flight. But his demeanor remained relaxed, and she noted how different he was from many others who would have immediately bristled at the idea of sitting next to a small child. As the flight crew made final checks and announcements filled the cabin, she pulled the baby blanket over her son's lap and secured her seatbelt. She couldn't help but glance sideways at the man again. How composed and self-contained he seemed, completely unlike the chaotic whirlwind her life had become. He caught her glance but said nothing, simply nodding with a reassuring calm. In that moment, though strangers, there was an unspoken acknowledgement between them, of exhaustion, of responsibility, and perhaps of two very different lives briefly intersecting at 30,000 feet. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, and the dim lights overhead gave the space a soft, sleepy glow. The woman adjusted her son's blanket and gently tucked his teddy bear into his arms. The little boy was already half asleep, his head leaning against the window, lulled by the vibration of the aircraft and the soft rumble beneath them. She reached over and brushed a few strands of hair from his forehead, whispering, "It's okay, baby. Just rest." The woman leaned back into her seat and exhaled, feeling the tightness in her chest ease slightly. Her eyelids were heavy, and despite trying to stay alert, her body betrayed her. She had been running on fumes for days, navigating child care, late-night feedings, a demanding job interview out of town, and now this flight back home. The pressure of being a single mother, of doing everything alone, pressed down like invisible weight on her shoulders. As the plane ascended into the night sky, she shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position. Her head tilted slightly to the side, and she accidentally brushed the shoulder of the man beside her. She immediately straightened, murmuring, "Sorry," almost too softly to be heard. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his head slightly and said, "It's all right. Don't worry." His voice was calm and steady, like a warm blanket in a cold room. A few minutes passed. Her head dipped again, this time landing gently against his shoulder. Her body, drained of energy and vigilance, gave in to the long-awaited rest. She was asleep. The man looked down for a moment, slightly surprised, but not bothered. He didn't move away or shift uncomfortably. Instead, he stayed perfectly still, adjusting his posture just enough to support her head more comfortably. His eyes wandered to the sleeping child by the window, then back to the woman who now leaned on him, her breath slow and even. He said nothing. There was a stillness in the air around them, a quiet pocket of peace amid the chatter and shuffling elsewhere in the cabin. The flight attendants passed by with carts, and one of them glanced at the pair. She smiled quietly at the unexpected scene but continued without comment. As the man sat there, a strange feeling of calm settled over him too. He was used to business meetings, structured days, and formal conversations. But this vulnerable, simple moment, felt more meaningful than anything he had experienced in a long time. He stayed still, allowing the tired stranger at his side the dignity of rest, without judgment, without interruption. And so, at 35,000 feet in the sky, under the dim glow of cabin lights, a weary mother slept soundly on a stranger's shoulder, protected for once, even if only for a few hours. As the plane cruised steadily through the night sky, the cabin gradually settled into a quiet lull. Overhead lights dimmed to a soft amber, and the low hum of the engines became the soundtrack to whispered conversations, flickering movie screens, and the occasional clink of a coffee cup being placed gently on a tray. Most passengers were now reclining, some dozing with neck pillows in place, others absorbed in books or watching the in-flight entertainment. But in row 23, a different kind of scene was unfolding, one that began to draw subtle, curious attention. The woman, still asleep, remained leaned against the man's shoulder, completely unaware of her surroundings. Her body had given in fully to sleep, her breathing slow and even. A few strands of hair fell across her face, and her fingers still clutched a corner of her son's blanket. Her son, nestled by the window, stirred lightly but didn't wake. The soft stuffed bear lay under one small hand, his other thumb tucked into his mouth, calm and undisturbed. What drew the quiet attention of others was not the mother's slumber, but the man's complete stillness and quiet patience. Some passengers who had initially noticed the child with mild irritation now looked on with softened expressions. The sharply dressed man, clearly someone of stature by his appearance, had not only allowed the woman to sleep on him but had now shifted his arms slightly behind her, giving her subtle support so she wouldn't lean too far or be jolted by the turbulence. He hadn't picked up his tablet again, hadn't sighed or rolled his eyes. Instead, he sat calmly, looking out into the dark sky as if keeping watch over both mother and child. A flight attendant approached quietly, her cart slowing as she glanced down at the trio. She hesitated briefly, as if unsure whether to offer something or let them be. The man turned toward her with a gentle expression and spoke in a hushed voice. "Could you bring a blanket, please? For the child." His voice carried a warmth, not command. She nodded, returning quickly with a small, folded airline blanket. He carefully took the blanket and, with deliberate softness, draped it over the sleeping boy, adjusting it so that his tiny feet wouldn't be exposed to the cold cabin air. Not once did he disturb the mother resting on his shoulder. The attendant gave him a small nod of appreciation before walking away, glancing back once with a faint smile. Nearby passengers exchanged silent glances. One older woman in the opposite row, who had noticed the mother struggling during boarding, now watched the scene with teary eyes. She whispered to her husband, "I wish more people had his heart." No words were spoken between the man and the mother during this time. She continued sleeping peacefully, unaware of the quiet kindness surrounding her. But the presence of one compassionate stranger had shifted the atmosphere entirely. In a world where people were often too rushed, too guarded, or too self-absorbed, his calm acceptance and empathy stood out, not in a dramatic way, but in the quietest, most human way possible. While the rest of the plane pressed on through the clouds, row 23 had become its own little sanctuary, an island of unexpected grace in the middle of the sky. Somewhere over the mountains, long after the cabin lights had dimmed and most passengers had sunk into varying stages of sleep or distraction, the quiet spell was finally broken. A small jolt of turbulence shook the aircraft gently, not enough to alarm, but just enough to stir those who were only lightly asleep. The woman stirred first, her brow furrowing as if coming out of a long, uneasy dream. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open. She blinked, confused for a moment at the unfamiliar softness beneath her cheek. Realization hit her in a wave. Her eyes darted sideways, and to her horror, she saw that she had been sleeping against the shoulder of the man beside her, the well-dressed, dignified man she had apologized to just hours earlier. She instantly straightened in her seat, mortified, her hands flying up to smooth her disheveled hair. "Oh my God," she whispered, turning toward him. "I am so sorry, I didn't mean to, I didn't even realize I." The man turned to her with the same calm smile he'd worn since the flight began. "It's all right," he said simply. "You needed it." His voice was gentle, and he looked at her not with judgment or discomfort, but with something more surprising, respect. The woman's eyes searched his face, still trying to read the situation. Was he just being polite? Was he mocking her? But no, there was something in his expression that felt genuine. She placed a hand over her chest, trying to catch her breath, her heart thudding from the embarrassment. "I really didn't mean to fall asleep on you, it's been a rough few days." "I could tell," he replied. "You're doing a lot. On your own." He glanced briefly toward her sleeping son, still curled up with the teddy bear. "He's lucky to have you." Those words hit her harder than she expected. Her lips parted slightly, but she couldn't speak right away. It had been so long since someone acknowledged her efforts without a trace of pity or condescension. Just honest recognition. She gave a small nod, eyes shimmering. Then, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card. He held it out to her without fanfare. She looked down at it, puzzled, and took it slowly. "My company runs a community initiative," he said. "We're building a team for a project focused on supporting working single parents. I couldn't help but notice how much strength it takes to do what you do, and frankly, I think you'd be a perfect fit." She blinked, staring. The steady hum of the airplane filled the space between them as the woman stared down at the glossy business card still resting in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly as they held it, more from the flood of emotions rushing through her than from any lingering nervousness. On the front was a name she had seen before, though never imagined she would speak to in person, let alone sleep on his shoulder. The elegant logo of his company gleamed faintly under the cabin lights, and beneath it, in clear, dignified print, was his full name, followed by the title, Chief Executive Officer. She blinked hard, trying to push back the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, but her throat had already tightened. The last few years flashed through her mind in jagged fragments, late-night crying spells when the baby wouldn't sleep, job interviews missed because she couldn't find childcare, judgmental glances in grocery stores, bills piling up on the kitchen counter. No one had ever seen her as anything more than a struggling single mom. Until now. The man shifted slightly in his seat, turning toward her with a look of calm sincerity. "I don't usually make offers mid-flight," he said, a trace of amusement in his voice. "But something about the way you handled everything, from boarding the plane to caring for your son, with such calm, stood out. Most people underestimate what it takes to do what you're doing." She looked up at him, speechless. Her voice was caught somewhere between a whisper and a sob. "I don't even have a degree. I used to work front desk at a hotel before the pandemic, then everything just fell apart." He nodded, listening without judgment. "This opportunity isn't about resumes. It's about resilience. Our new program is looking for real-life experience, people who understand struggle and know how to push through. We'll train the right people from the ground up. Your story isn't a weakness, it's your strength." His words pierced something deep inside her. For years, she had hidden her struggles as best she could, ashamed to admit how lost she often felt. But here, at 30,000 feet in the air, someone had seen past the exhaustion, the messy hair, and the bags under her eyes, and recognized something she had almost forgotten herself, her worth. She let out a small, shaky laugh, brushing away a tear. "This doesn't feel real. Most life-changing moments don't," he said with a small smile. "But when they come, you don't question them. You just step into them." She nodded slowly, her chest rising with a deeper breath than she'd taken all day. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about survival. She was thinking about possibility. Maybe she wouldn't be stuck in endless part-time jobs forever. Maybe she could offer her son a future filled with stability, maybe even joy. The little boy stirred beside her, half waking, then curled back up against the window. She looked at him, then at the man seated beside her. "If I do this, I don't want it to be charity." "It's not," he replied, his tone warm but firm. "It's opportunity. And you've earned it." The woman sat back in her seat, still clutching the card like a lifeline. The weight on her shoulders hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't carrying it alone. The woman sat motionless in her seat, the CEO's business card resting delicately in her lap like something sacred. She gazed at it in silence, her eyes glassy with unshed tears, as if blinking might shatter the fragile moment she was living in. For so long, she had been navigating survival mode, no time to dream, no space for hope. But now, this single act of kindness and belief from a stranger had cracked something open inside her. Her heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with a foreign, fragile feeling, hope. She turned slightly to look at the man once more, her lips parted as if to speak, but words caught in her throat. He met her eyes, and his expression softened further, sensing the whirlwind of emotions she couldn't yet name. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded slowly, unable to stop the tears that finally spilled over. They streamed silently down her cheeks as she offered him a grateful smile through trembling lips. "You have no idea what this means to me," she whispered. "You don't even know me, and yet, you just gave me more than anyone has in years." The man's gaze was steady, kind. "I don't need to know every detail to see your strength. Most people fold under the kind of pressure you carry every day. You didn't. That says everything." At those words, she finally broke. A sob escaped her lips, not loud, not disruptive, but full of a grief that had been quietly building for far too long. Years of exhaustion, frustration, self-doubt, and loneliness collapsed into this moment of release. She covered her mouth with one hand, overwhelmed by the emotional flood, while the other clutched the card as if it were the only real thing anchoring her. "I've been so tired," she choked out. "So invisible. Like no one saw me anymore. Just another single mom, taking up space." He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice but keeping his tone firm. "You're not invisible. You're extraordinary. Don't let the world convince you otherwise." The words weren't rehearsed. They weren't spoken to impress or flatter. They were real. And because of that, they burrowed deep into her, rewiring something that had been damaged by years of trying to hold it all together alone. The little boy beside her stirred slightly, murmuring in his sleep. She wiped her cheeks quickly and looked at him, brushing his hair back gently with her fingers. For a moment, she simply watched him, his innocence, his peace, and felt something awaken in her that she hadn't felt in a long time, purpose not rooted in sacrifice but in potential. She turned back to the man and whispered, "Thank you. Not just for this opportunity, but for seeing me. Really seeing me." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes, all it takes is one moment to remind someone who they really are." She smiled through the tears now. And not just a polite smile, but one that came from somewhere deep and real. She no longer felt like a burden. She felt like a woman being given the dignity of possibility, of being invited back into the world not as someone barely holding on, but as someone with something to offer. The plane rumbled slightly as it began its slow descent, the city lights flickering in the distance below like stars scattered across the earth. She sat upright now, straighter than before, her hand resting protectively on her son's blanket, and the card tucked securely into her bag. Her eyes were still wet, but her face held something new, an expression not of exhaustion but of quiet determination. In that moment, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. As the plane descended through the layers of mist and cloud, the early morning light began to seep into the cabin, painting the passengers' faces with a soft golden hue. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and flight attendants moved down the aisles, checking that trays were stowed and seats upright. The woman shifted slightly in her seat, wiping the last traces of tears from her cheeks and smoothing her son's blanket with a tenderness born of renewed strength. The exhaustion was still there in her bones, but something else pulsed beneath it now. A quiet, powerful sense of momentum. Her son slowly stirred beside her, blinking groggily as the city skyline came into view beyond the airplane window. She smiled down at him, brushing his messy hair aside. "We're almost home, baby," she whispered, and this time, the word home didn't sound like a dead end. It sounded like a beginning. As the wheels of the plane touched down with a soft thud, passengers around them began gathering their belongings, stretching, yawning, checking phones. The usual impatience of landing was in the air. But for her, time felt slower, each moment infused with deeper meaning. She stole one last glance at the man beside her. He was calmly powering off his tablet, slipping it into his briefcase. He caught her gaze and gave her a small, knowing nod. "You'll do great," he said simply. "I don't know what will happen," she replied, her voice steady, "but I know I'll try. Harder than ever." "That's more than enough to start," he said. She stood with her son, adjusting his coat, helping him out of his seat. The little boy was still half asleep, leaning against her as she slung the diaper bag over one shoulder. But she held her head high. No longer weighed down by the shame of struggle, she now carried herself like someone who had just remembered she mattered. As they made their way down the aisle, the world outside the airplane seemed a little different, not because it had changed, but because she had. She walked not as a woman invisible to those around her, but as someone seen, validated, and offered a door she never knew could open. The card was tucked safely in her purse, yet it felt as though she were holding it in her hand the whole time, proof that fate had finally looked her way. They stepped into the bright corridor of the airport, the morning sun cascading through the terminal windows. Other passengers rushed ahead, lost in their own lives, but she walked at her own pace. Her son looked up at her and asked, "Mommy, where are we going now?" She looked down at him, a soft smile forming on her lips. "Someplace better," she said. "We're going somewhere better." As they exited the gate, she glanced behind her once, just for a second. The man had already disappeared into the crowd, no farewell, no parting speech. Just a moment in time, a quiet miracle on a sleepless night that had changed everything. With her son's small hand gripped firmly in hers, she walked forward. Toward possibility. Toward dignity. Toward a future no longer defined by fear and fatigue, but by choice, opportunity, and hope. And somewhere, deep in her heart, she made a silent promise: "This is the moment my story changes."